Yes, you're right. You have already seen my favourite books of 2024. However, you have not seen all of my favourite books of 2024. I am, of course, a children's bookseller, which means I read a lot of children's books throughout the year as well. And I had so many favourite middle grade and young adult books this year that I knew I needed to make a separate list. So in this video, we have a great mix of junior fiction, middle grade, young adult, and even a non-fiction. Talking about children's books as a children's bookseller online can sometimes be a little bit tricky. So I want to be very clear. All of these books are my personal favourites of the year. They are books that I love to recommend to young readers, but they're far from the only books or even the books that I recommend the most. I'm always trying to find the right book for the right reader, you know, not just pushing my favourites, if you can believe it. So I think if you are looking for recommendations for books to purchase for a young person in your life, I hope you get some good ideas from this list. But also, if you're an adult who just likes to or wants to read more middle grade graphic novels or young adult, this list is also for you. Let's dive right in with my 10th favourite children's book of the year, which is Wurrtoo. This is a super fun, super charming middle grade that I think for independent readers of like 7, 8 plus is perfect, but also I think it's like one of those books that would be a really fun read aloud for ages 6 plus. It's been billed as the Indigenous version of Blinky Bill, kind of feels a little bit Winnie Pooh. It's sweet, fun and charming, but also has a solid adventure. Basically, we're following Wurrtoo, who is this grumpy old wombat who doesn't really have any friends. He literally only comes out at night so he can avoid everybody else in the forest, but he's also in love with the sky. What a cutie. And so he is spending all day and all night digging a burrow as big as possible, a burrow big enough to fit the sky, so that when he asks her to marry him, she'll be able to move in. And at the point we meet Wurrtoo, basically he's done. He's finally finished building this massive burrow. And so he's ready to go on a little adventure to find the highest point that he can, to get as close to the sky as he can to ask her to marry him. And basically along the way, adventure ensues, but also he makes a bunch of very unlikely friends. And it's just so sweet. It's so charming. I liked it a lot. Next up, we've got our first young adult book on the list. This is Something More by Jackie Khalilieh, and this is a contemporary romance, kind of like a love triangle situation going on. In this book, we're following 15-year-old Jessie, who is a Palestinian Canadian, and she's also autistic. We meet her just as she's about to start high school, and she's kind of like planning how she's going to approach starting at this new school. And one thing's for sure is she's going to be keeping her autism diagnosis a secret. And basically we just follow Jessie as she kind of starts to make some friends, but also to develop some crushes. One crush in particular. And now this is a bit of a tricky book for me to talk about because in some ways I found this book infuriating. Like it's very angsty and the romance is definitely center stage here. But what I loved about this book was the exploration of female friendships, particularly in the context of neurodivergence here for Jessie. I have never read a young adult contemporary that I have related to more, that I feel like is more realistic. To be fair, Jessie is like way more boy crazy than I was at her age, but the friendship dynamics and just like navigating all of that stuff, especially as a neurodivergent kid, like this just spoke to my younger self in a way that she has never been spoken to before. So not only would I recommend this for young readers ages 12 and over, I would also recommend this to anybody looking to read more Palestinian authors, especially if you like a bit of romance, or for anybody looking for some really realistic, honest, autistic representation in young adult. Now for something a lot more fun and playful, this is The Fairy Tale Fan Club by Richard Aoyade. This is a really fun little book with some great production, lots of illustrations, and it's delivered in kind of like bite-sized chunked pieces. And essentially the premise is that this is narrated by the head of the Fairy Tale Fan Club. His name is C.C. Sicily, and basically he gets a bunch of letters from fairy tale fans all over the world, and sometimes he receives letters that he feels deserve answers, so he passes them on to the fairy tale character in question, and this is them responding. So that's it. That's basically the gist. We get letters from Sleeping Beauty and the Big Bad Wolf, Pinocchio, Cinderella. The whole cast is here. And this was just a silly, goofy time. I literally found myself laughing out loud and I was like, I'm 34 years old. I shouldn't find this funny. But I did. I would be recommending this to kids age 7 and over, whether as an independent read or something to read together. I think especially because each chapter is essentially just a couple of pages, it's really accessible and it's just funny. It's just a good, funny time. I have just made a last minute change to the running order, but next up we have As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow. This is just a proof copy, so I don't have like the actual cover, but I will pop it up here for you. This is a hard-hitting young adult book. It's one of the most beautifully written young adult books I've read in a long time. It's set in Syria during the Civil War, and we're following a young woman named Salama who from memory was studying to be a pharmacist, but essentially because of the dire circumstances that have resulted from the Civil War, medical professionals of kind of like any education level and any field are desperately needed. And so she is filling in for the role of a doctor in an emergency kind of situation. It's been a little while since I read this book, but from memory, she's about 19 years old. So it's harrowing stuff. We're literally following her as she's like doing her day-to-day thing at the hospital, caring for people in need in the midst of a brutal, brutal civil war. Salama has also experienced a lot of loss and grief herself. And the way that this book explores all of that together is just so poignant. Like, a book as harrowing as this doesn't really have any right being as beautiful as this book is, and yet it is, and yet the author manages to pull it off. There's also a really lovely romance that develops throughout this book. I think this is definitely the kind of young adult book, and like the quality and like the depth of exploration of themes here makes it a book that I can see plenty of adult readers loving as well. For me as a children's bookseller, I wouldn't generally be recommending this for readers under 15 years. Obviously every reader is different, but the themes and the explicit detail that we get of the horrors that Salama is like watching and experiencing and facing, it's just a lot. A very powerful, important book, but it's a lot. A book I can highly recommend if you're looking for Syrian stories, especially if you're somebody who really loves gritty, honest portrayals of tragedy and the horrors of war, but you also want some really special, beautiful, almost like soulmate level romance about two people who find each other when they need each other most. Honestly, this book is just kind of breathtaking. Next up, we have one of the middle grades that I've probably recommended the most this Christmas season. It is The Hotel Balzaar by Katey DiCamillo. And this is actually the first Katey DiCamillo book I have ever read. It is part of a series, kind of, from what I understand. The Narendi Tales is Katey DiCamillo's kind of like one of her worlds that she's created. And this is one of the books that fits within that world. But there is no kind of like overarching plot, at least from what I know. Like, this feels very much like a standalone story. So you can absolutely read it as a standalone, just as I did. This book just feels like a fairy tale. It's so beautifully written. I really love Katey DiCamillo's voice in this book. In this, we're following a young girl named Marta who lives at a big old hotel, the Hotel Balzaar, because her mother is the maid there. And every morning for as long as Marta can remember, her mother has reminded her to keep out of everybody's way, not to talk to anybody, be as quiet as a mouse, to essentially be invisible. But one day, an old lady with a big parrot on her shoulder walks in to the hotel. She's a mysterious countess who sees Martha, points at her and says, I have some stories for you. Come and visit me. And so Martha does just that. She starts visiting this countess. And over the course of the book, we get 7 different stories. And we literally read, like it's stories within stories kind of thing. We get to read as the countess tells Martha these 7 different stories, which we slowly learn are kind of interconnected and maybe have something to do with Marta's missing father. There was just something about the writing and the vibe here that I loved. Like I said, very like fairy tale kind of feeling. Whimsical, magical, atmospheric. I just loved it. This is a book I would be recommending for readers 7, 8 plus, but also, again, a great read aloud, I think. Next up, we have my only non-fiction to grace this list. This is We Are Palestinian, a celebration of culture and tradition. Obviously, it's a little hard for me to show you and flick through, but this is a beautiful introduction to just that, Palestinian culture and tradition. Some of the illustrations in here are just gorgeous. It's just over 100 pages long, so you do get quite a lot of information in here. It goes over a whole host of topics. I'll give you kind of like the highlights from the table of contents, which includes geography, cultural symbols, creative minds, which is kind of like famous and important creatives of Palestine, agriculture, cuisine, performing arts, and history and religion. So there is a little bit about, like the Nakba and the occupation and stolen land and all of that sort of stuff. So I think especially for young people who have been kind of asking questions about what's going on in Palestine, this could be a great introduction. But that is not really where the book overall is focusing. Instead, the book is much more about Palestinian culture and tradition, which I think alongside learning about the horrors of what is happening in Palestine is so important to humanize the people of Palestine. I think this book could also be really special for young Palestinians living in the diaspora, but also just a great book for anybody looking to learn a little bit more about Palestine, Palestinian culture. Like, yes, I have been recommending and hand-selling this book at work to folks coming in asking those sort of questions, wanting to know more about Palestine. but also just me as a reader. I loved reading this. It was just such a beautiful introduction, a little like sampling of a whole host of different elements of Palestinian culture. I really loved learning a little bit more about the agriculture. I loved reading about some of the prominent creative voices, artists, that sort of thing, some of whom I knew, many of whom I didn't. I think especially right now in the West, when so much of what we hear about Palestine in terms of like mass media is an attempt to undermine or erase Palestinian identity, something like this could not be more important. It's joyful, it's beautiful, but it's also important. Highly, highly, highly recommend, obviously. Number 4 is my favorite middle grade novel of the year. It is, of course, The Last Cuentista. I read this so early in the year. This is definitely a middle grade I can see a lot of adults loving, just as I did. It is a book that I have been able to hand sell very successfully. I've had people come back and like tell me how much they loved this book, but it's not a book that I feel like I can hand sell to everybody. I don't think this is a book for every kid. It's not like a mass general recommendation. It is, however, for the right reader, incredible. This is kind of like a near future science fiction dystopia, but with magical realism elements. Our main character's name is Petra, and we meet her basically when Halley's Comet has been pushed off course and is coming straight for Earth. And it is projected to basically wipe out most life on Earth. Tragic, horrible stuff. However, Petra and her family have managed to score one of the few seats on board a rocket that is leaving for Earth to find a new home. And I don't really want to give too many more details specifically about the plot, but basically in so many ways, this is a middle grade book about fascism and how important storytelling, meaning making, and values are in resisting fascism. And also a bit of an ode, I think, to how essential stories are to our humanness. It's really beautifully written, thematically rich, there's a lot going on here. And while part of me feels like this would have been a much easier sell if it had been aged up a couple of years and directly marketed at young adult audiences, I do kind of love that this is in the middle fiction section. It's not an easy read though, both in terms of the level of writing and the content, but also there are some harder emotional moments as well. So generally speaking, I would be recommending this to ages 10, 11 plus, but there's not really like an age cap where I would stop recommending this. I think this is one of those books that if you're going to like this book, you're going to love this book, you know? Next we have coming in at third spot, I've kind of cheated, I'm putting 2 books here, Garlic and the Vampire and Garlic and the Witch, which is a little graphic novel duology, but I read them back to back, so in my mind I very much think of them together, even though you could read especially Garlic and the Vampire as a standalone. If I had to pick one, Garlic and the Vampire was my favorite, but I loved both of them and I loved them both so much together. This is so cute, so wholesome. This is absolutely the kind of thing that is for fans of the Tea Dragon Society. As far as graphic novels are concerned, I'd be recommending this for ages 8, 9 plus. Basically, we're just following this little character here. Her name is Garlic. She's an anthropomorphic garlic. She lives with a bunch of other anthropomorphic vegetables in a witch's garden, and she's a little bit anxious, a little bit sensitive, but one day a vampire moves in next door, and all the vegetables and the witch are kind of freaking out about like, what is this vampire doing? What does he want? And so obviously, Garlic is the only one who is guaranteed to be safe around the vampire. So she's basically kind of like automatically elected to go and suss him out, to go knock on his door and find out what he's doing here and what he wants. And it's just so sweet. It's so sweet watching this scared little Garlic kind of just choose to do the right thing, do the best that she can. But obviously when she meets the vampire, things are just like not as they seem. And this is just so wholesome and adorable. The second book is a little bit more like coming of age, and it's kind of like an allegory for puberty. It's really beautiful too. The illustrations in these are just gorgeous, and Garlic is one of those characters who should just be like a silly, goofy little thing that I like read, enjoyed, and forgot about, but instead a year later I'm still thinking about her. I love her, and I love these books. In my number 2 spot, we have my favorite young adult book of the year. This is We Didn't Think It Through by Gary Lonesborough. You might remember in previous years, I have not shut up about Gary Lonesborough's debut book, which was The Boy from the Mish, which has been published under a different name in America. I'll put the cover here. This book is very different from The Boy from the Mish, which was like a queer romance coming of age kind of story. But there's just something about Gary Lonesborough's writing and the way that he does character that just works so well for me. It's so colloquially written, it's so easy to get into, and you just like know these characters from the first few pages. You like know who they are. They're so embodied on the page. In this book, we're following an Indigenous boy who I think is like 15, 16 years old. His name is Jamie, and we meet him kind of like at a crossroads in his life. Basically, he's grown up with 2 best mates, and at this moment in time, they're kind of realizing that they're all about to go in very different directions. So they decide to have one last big party together. And things get a bit silly and they just kind of make some bad decisions, which combined with a racist judicial system results in Jamie ending up in juvenile detention, which is a hugely topical and important issue in Australia at the moment and for a long time, to be honest, particularly of the over-representation of Aboriginal folks in incarceration rates here in Australia. They're literally the most incarcerated population on planet Earth, but particularly of Black and Indigenous kids. And so this is just a very intimate, character-centered portrayal of a really good kid at heart, having made some bad decisions, who needs some discipline, sure, but primarily needs love and support at a really difficult time, and instead is criminalized. Having said all of that, of course, it's Gary Lonesborough, so he does manage to walk that line of honesty with beautiful characters, beautiful relationships, and just enough optimism. This is a book I would be recommending to kids over the ages of 14, I think especially young boys. I just love the way that Gary Lonesborough writes teenage boys, how he illustrates a lot of the struggles around masculinity, obviously intersected with Aboriginal identity, but he always manages to bring in this invitation to the reader of vulnerability and empathy and affection and relying on other people and talking and how important those things are. Again, though, I think this is a book a lot of people will love, and if you read Boy from the Mish, which was a very popular and well celebrated book, please don't forget that Gary Lonesborough has since published even more books and they're wonderful. And then finally we have my favourite children's book of the year, my favourite graphic novel of the year, honestly one of my favourite books of the year. It is of course The Seance Tea Party. This is a book I've been meaning to read for ages. Again, it's a title that I see kind of like mentioned in the same breaths, in the same circles as things like the Tea Dragon Society. The illustrations are very cute. Overall, the tone is very sweet and wholesome in a similar kind of way. But this book is directly dealing with topics around grief, aging, and mortality. And it just does such a good job. I cannot get over it. If you watch the vlog where I read this, I was liking the first half well enough. I thought it was really pretty, it was really cute, but it was around the halfway point that I realized that I was just like obsessed with this book and it was going to be on my favorites list at the end of the year. Basically, we're following Laura, who is a young girl. I think she's kind of like 12, 13. Basically, she's like on that precipice of moving into teenagerhood, but she just doesn't quite feel ready yet, which I just so identified with. But basically at this point in her life, she rediscovers her old imaginary friend, Alexa. But we learn pretty quickly that Alexa was not actually ever just an imaginary friend. She's actually a ghost. And so this book is a lot about their friendship and about them helping each other. But essentially what I think hit me so hard was the way that this book juxtaposes their two very different experiences. One, a young girl who is kind of really scared of growing up and resisting it. And with the other, a dead girl who will never get the opportunity to grow up. We also get to know some older characters and watch them reflect on life and death and mortality and aging. And I just loved it. I just loved it. I would have loved this book when I was like 11, 12, 13, kind of like at the same point Laura is, or I'm moving into high school, but that world just feels like a bit too mature and adult than I'm ready to be. It's such a big moment moving from like a true child into a teenager. And obviously like how ages kind of determine how the world perceives us, but like obviously everybody develops and like emotionally matures at different points, and so it can just be a really tricky moment to navigate. And I think this book explored that really well, while also offering some really powerful messages too. It didn't feel like we were pushing Laura to mature faster. It felt like we were making space for her to take her time, while also reminding her and the reader that yes, growing up can be scary, but it can also be beautiful and wonderful, and it can be a huge privilege that not everybody will get. I just loved this book. I loved it so much. This is one of my top 5 favorite graphic novels of all time. So those are my top 10 favorite children's books, middle grade, young adult of 2024. I would love to hear in the comments below if you've read any of these, or if you plan on reading any of these, or if you had any of your own favorites in 2024. A big thank you as always goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Lynette Brown, and Marie, and thank you for watching, for hanging out with me. I will see you again next week. Until then, so much love and happy reading. Bye!